All right, well, we now have the opportunity to kind of work towards our roundtable discussions later today, and we're going to kick things off with a panel discussion with some of our working group leads and some of the folks that you've had a chance to hear from already. And this panel discussion is going to be moderated by Joe Sapiente. Beth introduced Joe earlier. Joe's going to be taking over as the committee chair for the MDIC Case for Quality Committee next year, but has been one of the champions for Case for Quality since the beginning. So Joe, if you want to come up, and all of our panelists, I'll have you make your way up here as well. If you see your name, you know, they're in no order, and it might be
Want to get any? No, you're stuck. You can't go.
Yeah, I know.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Joe Sapiente, Vice President of Quality Regulatory Affairs for Hologic, actually 2 of the 4 divisions of Hologic. And as mentioned, I've been part of the Case for Quality for quite a long time, I guess 5 or so years. But some of the points that have been mentioned and the phrases that have been used around collaboration and transparency and trust were the basic foundations of the Case for Quality when we started, and have been consistent throughout. So it's a pleasure to be part of the team and to lead the team in 2018. As mentioned, we've assembled the panel here, and most of them you've already heard from everyone, so I'll skip the introductions. But with us, we've got Beth Staub, Ann Ferreter, Mike Schiller, George Zach, Kim Kaplan, and Cisco Vincenti. And the purpose of the panel really is to start to stimulate some thought around what we're going to be doing in an hour or so, or in 30 minutes or so. But also to give you an opportunity to ask some questions, and we'd like to also have the folks on the WebEx ask some questions as well, to sort of frame our thinking as we get into the session this afternoon. As Beth and Dr. Shuren mentioned this morning, you know, the journey started with planning. And it was all focused around the vision and mission for Case for Quality. And from that group, that initial meeting where we had probably our very first MDIC forum, we talked about what does Case for Quality look like under MDIC. And very similar to this group, a lot of the thought leaders came together and said, what we want to look at competencies, analytics, metrics, and maturity. And the teams, much like what we're going to do later this afternoon, talked about, well, what is that going to look like going forward? So for the folks on the panel, I'm going to ask you sort of take a look back to where we were 3-4 years ago when we said maturity model is something we want to go after, and look where we are today. And give that some thought, and I'll point to Cisco as well to sort of give us your vision of what you want the Case for Quality to continue to do in 18, and then what can we do to further it along with maybe other work streams that you might be interested in. And that's sort of the same question I want you all to think about while Cisco gives us our answer.
All right, so let's see if I can get some of this rolling and started. So looking forward to 2018, right now we've really defined a preset of the practice areas that we're focusing our effort on. It's, you know, purposely done, right? We want to touch base with that. But one of the things I think that we want to be able to do in 2018 is expand that, right? We want to go a little bit bigger, get some of the pilots in to look past those 11 areas, right? How do we start integrating more of some of those higher level activities so that we can actually, you know, one of the things that we want to drive is that continuous improvement and change, even in that 510K space. So how do we get to that kind of visibility in the 2018 timeframe? And then the other piece that I think is something very impactful to even just start considering, right? We don't necessarily need to be there, but the construct and the concept of, what are those right performance indicators that we as a collective should care about from how the organization is performing? How do we get to that state? How do we get to the point where that's visible so that, we can leverage the assessment not as that static checkpoint, but as your true value driver for improvement, not how we're monitoring things, not how we're making, our decisions, how we're incorporating that into review, right? It goes back to that visibility that enables more of that trust. A lot of what we've seen in even just engagements with other industries and other manufacturers is that's almost part and parcel to the original culture development is everybody there has visibility and sees what's happening, not from the standpoint of, I gotcha, but from the standpoint of we need to know what's going on as early as possible so that we can make adjustments, so we can really catch things before they happen. And if you really think about what is the role that we're looking to play here, it's not necessarily a situation of oversight, but it's that awareness, right? Where is it that we need to maybe help drive differences? Where is it that we should be focusing our time and energy on? If somebody's not there, can we dedicate our resources to bringing somebody else up to that level? And then we don't have to really spend our energy on this end. We could just spot check and say, okay, everything's moving along. We're good. Let's keep that moving and focus where some of the needs are. We talk about that small innovative space. That may be something that we as an agency need to be more focused on, not from the standpoint of, again, compliance, but maybe there's an education component that we've got to take a more active role in. Can't develop that now if we're all kind of working on trying to inspect in the compliance aspects elsewhere.
Okay, great. And for George and Kim, based on sort of Cisco's outlook and knowing that we're at the pilot phase, how do we start to maybe get the message out as to what the future looks like? You talked a little bit about success earlier today. What does success look like? But maybe as an interim to success, sort of how do we build that pathway towards maybe aligning to what Cisco was talking about?
That's really hot, I guess. So I think really for 2018, it's imperative that we're demonstrating first and foremost all of those program execution pieces. That's really my tactical goal with this program in 2018. All the questions that, I'd rather that January 1, 2019, that this presentation would be 15 Rob Beckers singing the praise of the program instead, right? As opposed to going through and having to answer all the tactical questions about scalability, which particular practice areas. I would hope that we're seeing Rob and folks like Rob say, because we have had a reduction in our regulatory and compliance concerns, or the effort that we have to put towards that, we've been able to innovate in this particular space, and this is how that's demonstrable within our company. What that looks like for an Edwards versus a Medtronic versus a Boston Scientific, I don't know, but that's the message that I want to see. It requires that trust from the industry. It requires that trust from the FDA. So I think there's a balance there. We have to demonstrate this program in 2018 so that we're singing that song of innovation beyond.
Okay.
Yeah, sort of along the same note, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but being able to talk about the benefits that organizations are seeing from implementing this model and being able to get those appraisal results and being able to then internally go back and start to make those improvements and be able to see what those benefits look like and be able to talk more about that, because it is twofold. Part of it is the regulatory modifications that help to remove some of the burdens to innovation, but the other part is that internal continuous improvement that also helps to drive that innovation. So in more, I guess, practical terms, it's like being able to see improvement in the metrics that we're measuring could be a longer year-end goal, and then even longer term, being able to tie those improvements that we see to patient outcomes.
And I'll stay with the theme. So Mike and Ann, as you talk about the pathway for 2018 and what we've heard so far in terms of what your vision for 2018 is, any adjustments based on how you can align with Cisco, Kim and George around the value of the data and then the different audience? So the audience is going to be very different, but the value of data may be similar. So any thoughts there?
Well, the audience, I think that's an important topic that you just mentioned there, Joe. I think what we're seeing here really is a move from a product-centric model to a patient-centric model. And by that I mean everything revolves around the patient. As more care moves into the non-acute care space, that patient-centric model becomes even more important. And I think one of the other patient groups, and it's not really a patient group, but one of the other groups that we really haven't talked about today is the consumer and the consumerism of healthcare and the access to transparent data that they are going to require with higher deductible, narrow network plans. We, as consumers, in every other aspect where we're looking to purchase, we are going out and we're accessing data. We're accessing information that guides our decision. Again, to the point earlier, we're not all going to go buy the same car, but we're all going to go ahead and use those very Kelley Blue Book and other resources to identify what is the best car for me. So the consumer, I think, is a very important group that really needs to be considered. So I think Dr. Ruland touched on it, and it's moving from reliance on a single or limited data sets, and it's really looking at a more robust dashboard that incorporates multiple data sets as opposed to what we're currently looking at now. And that would be medical device recalls, that would be clinicaltrials.gov, that would be MedSun, some of these other data sources that we have traditionally looked at. How do we augment the valuable data that resides in those data pools, but how do we augment that data with other data sources? So I think that really moving forward from looking at a 2018 perspective, we need to absolutely look at the non-acute care space. We absolutely need to be looking at the consumer, and we absolutely need to be looking at other data sets to augment the rich data that we currently have.
And just to take a practical perspective for 2018, we're really building the dashboard program right now. We don't have a viable dashboard. We're establishing what are the rules or the best processes for working with registries. So I want to reset expectations. There's not a dashboard with tons of data. This is the process of building, the process of defining, the process of determining how things are calculated and what data quality we can expect and sources we can define.
Thank you. So Beth, we'll save the best for last here. You and I have had a number of conversations, and certainly as part of our transition, we're talking about how do we really lead the case for quality in 2018. So give us your thoughts about what you've seen and what you'd like to see for 2018 so that we can meet your expectations and continue your legacy.
Oh, well, that's it's been a great joy, really, to work with everybody and be part of a true transformation of an industry. There aren't very many people who can say they participated like that, as we all are in their careers. Two things come to mind for me when I think about this, and as Joe will see, I didn't tell him this until he accepted the new role. In that role, you find yourself thinking about this a lot. The first is around the space that we've previously talked about of competencies, this idea of how to. If you think about what the maturity model is doing for us, it's measuring how well somebody's doing something. The regulation tells you what you have to do. As companies more and more start to take advantage of tools like the maturity model and identify their gaps, they're going to need to find ways to fill those gaps. And I think it's a space that MDIC can play a role in. We've done some work in that competency space. Pat Baird is here, who's done some work around that. We've partnered with AVAMED a bit around the Library of Successful Practices. For me, there's more to do there. One of the reasons that we looked at AVAMED, because they do have an educational arm. That's not something that right now is what MDIC does. I think ASQ is potentially a vehicle for some things. There's a whole body of work around really the science of quality there. So matching up the how are we doing, what does the regulation require you to do, with some great how-tos that is not just more than the library, for me, is one that's worth some consideration. And figuring out what role MDIC versus other organizations play in that. The other one is a platform that was initially introduced by the FDA when the original Case for Quality white paper was introduced, which is the idea of the relationship between those in the district offices and the individual site locations. Because if you think about it, if you're a small to mid-sized medical device company who is doing class 1 or 2 products, you will have extremely limited interaction with the center. The face of the FDA for you is your district office. And even if you are already participating in maturity model and come off the work plan, the FDA will be coming in for recall, follow-up, for a whole variety of other things. So I think starting to build the partnership with the professionals for the FDA in the field, who really are the face for the majority of our medical device companies, making sure they understand the work that's happening, that they can be ambassadors and promoters of the case for quality of things like the maturity model. To me, it's growing the understanding that I think has come out of the kinds of exchanges that we've had together is another big opportunity. Through Cisco, we've been staying close with Jan Welsh. Obviously, there's a lot of transformation happening in the field, and I know she's committed to having that conversation when she gets to a point with a bit more stability. But to me, it's one that we shouldn't lose sight of, and a lot of good could come out of.
Great. So one of the things I want to also bring to the panel is something that we heard earlier today, and I think it comes up in a number of our forums. And it's something that Robert mentioned during his presentation, and Cisco, you talked about it as well, is that employee engagement, that frontline employee. So having some experience in my career with quality improvement programs that take you so far until you unlock the value of the frontline employee where they make that connection of touching the product, touching the patient. But I'd like to hear maybe some of the panelists' points of view as to how we incorporate more of that engagement into maybe the assessment and take that a little bit further. Anyone want to go first? George, you look like you're thinking there.
Yeah, I think it's pretty standard in the appraisals that I've executed or appraisal teams that I've been on. A primary difference between an appraisal activity and an audit-like activity or an inspection activity is that you are speaking to the people that are performing the work, and you are seeking their input as to how that work can be improved and where do they fit in a quality system, or where do they fit in the overall manufacturing line. As they're performing the work, they're often one of the best resources to tap into as to how to improve the work. What are the pain points that they're dealing with on a daily basis? Where are they seeing waste in your system? Also understanding the classic type of ISO questions as well there. Great, you have a quality system, you have a quality policy, you have quality objectives. How does that tie to you? So do you understand, line worker, how your activities are impacting the patient as well? That's pretty much part and parcel from my perspective of what occurs in appraisal activities when speaking in any particular session to those people that perform the work.
Okay. Cisco, Beth, anyone?
And then from a dashboard perspective, we definitely recognize that the voice of the customers, the patients, of the clinicians is key. And so we have patient satisfaction as one dashboard element. We have usability as a different dashboard element, trying to capture that physician response and their preferences and their needs. So trying to understand across a wider set of stakeholders is a strong focus, and I think that in conversations with maturing model folks, we're able to connect those concepts to the different practices as well.
So I think from a feedback point, what Rob mentioned, the fact that maybe next time we go around, there's something we want to incorporate more from that area. That's learning we can take back and kind of adjust to and make sure that at least that's being captured. One of the things that I think we learned, not just within the context of, just learning what the model's going on, but through work that was done by even engaging through our LRP team on their culture initiatives, talking with a lot of the manufacturers on how they really tackle that approach, learning from AVAMED and their culture initiative of what they're doing, right? We've met with a lot of different organizations, right? That construct, that concept of alignment always seems to be a big recurring theme in how it's driven. It seemed like it was independent of how it was kind of done by the company, but it mattered, right? That alignment piece and how do you get access and visibility to that? So I think, that's definitely as we're moving forward and really thinking through this, figuring out what pieces and what elements give us that insight becomes, I think, more critical. The more manufacturers we get through the process also, I think the better it is to kind of come out of it and say, well, look, this is what we're seeing in terms of alignment. The ones who are driving it really well are doing these things, right? And then that comes back and becomes another feedback cycle, maybe back to AVAMED in terms of the development of competencies, or maybe in terms of what they're driving within their education arm, right? But the idea of, we see that, we know it, we recognize that that's important. What it is exactly that we want to really target and how we want to share that, we still have some work to kind of get done and look through here.
I thought Rob's Venn diagram at the end of his presentation this morning was really interesting because, we get out of bed thinking about products and processes and the quality system and those kinds of things. But you rightly highlighted site leadership. It's not something that pops up really other than management responsibility anywhere in the kind of the normal kinds of either FDA or ISO audit. But the whole idea of culture and tone and when our associates and all our employees are in a position where the rules are gray or the intent could be misunderstood, what is that culture, that leadership intent or message that makes sure that they know exactly which way we want them to go? I think it's a difficult thing to measure, but I think it's a rich area to explore. I agree.
Right. I mean, frankly, I'd like to take, for the sites that are scheduled, I'd like to take Rob's, I hope this is being recorded, Stephanie, because I'd like to take Rob's presentation, and for each of our site coordinators that we're talking to, because I think the natural inclination is, okay, this is another audit. We heard that in Rob's, are we going to get additional stuff to do? Is there a 483 that's coming out of this? And they can hear it from us all day long, and they can hear it from Cisco all day long, that we're not going to come in and beat folks over the head. But I think hearing it from Rob and saying, hey, this is how it's different, and this is how you would have a better appraisal if you brought in those individual contributors, those frontline workers, it's going to speak a lot more volumes coming from an industry peer as opposed to the CMMI appraisal team or the FDA. So you're going to be, clicked on YouTube everywhere now.
There's a presentation fee that you might want to negotiate on all of this. Yeah, you never know.
I do think there needs to be a little thought to that, because that's a different set of interviews. Yeah. And it's got to be a separate set of interviews.
There's a different set of, that can't be combined with others in the organization if we want it to be meaningful, because it'll get masked pretty easily if it's not a very aligned group of those peers. So it's either an additional sampling that's maybe some of the practice areas get sampled at 2 different levels of the organization, or something like that. I think there needs to be a little bit of thought to how that would happen.
You've used focus groups in the past where you've frontline employees. Yeah. Great. All right, so we've got a couple of minutes left in our time before we break and then go to our breakout teams. But any questions from the group here or anyone on the WebEx have any questions for the panel that maybe we didn't cover that you want to cover? Kathleen?
I had one because you guys mentioned that culture was really hard to measure. And I know, I don't know if I sent an email to George, I don't know, but we've got this cultural assessment we do at Medtronic, and we don't know how it would align with the CMMI assessment, but we're just interested in, if it's not in there embedded in the practice areas, is that something that it's still open for maybe the group, the Case for Quality group, to look at how we put those cultural elements in there to make it a little bit easier to see?
So let me just, one of the things that we're looking to do, actually, the AdvaMed working group under Steve Silverman, is we're taking on a quality culture, a culture of quality initiative, which actually a couple of folks from your group are already part of that, as part of the founding and charter members. And we'll work with that to then combine those efforts so that we can include some of those questions, because I'm very familiar with the Medtronic program, and so I'm happy to say that I'm actually chairing the quality culture work stream under AdvaMed, so hopefully we'll be able to dovetail with what you guys are already doing, and culture is something that we're all very passionate about. So,
I think on that one, though, it's, again, to this issue of similar versus different. I think about tools, and Stryker has one, I'm sure many companies do. It's all about the outcomes, right? Just like there are dozens of different problem-solving techniques that you can do, and ultimately the question is, did you correctly solve your problem? There are lots of approaches to culture, and I think many companies consider that their secret sauce, and we need to make sure that we're respectful of that, but don't ignore it. And that's the trick, I think, for the team that will take that on.
It's like a balance. Yeah.
The other thing that came, I'm sorry, Robbie, the other thing that came to mind during today's session, and I'd like to get your feedback, is the concept of accreditation. Something that Dr. Shuren mentioned this morning is, how do we take the culture of quality and the case for quality and eventually make it, there's a competition, there's a competitive advantage. So is certification something that we're willing to think about and maybe take on as to what does that look like, so that we can start to have a medical device Baldrige Award type approach where there's certification or accreditation? Give you guys some of any thoughts about that.
Well, and I think this was also asked to some degree over here. There is a view of the model that is in the context of maturity levels, and we have, for the time being, to keep the focus appropriate, we're not using the maturity level approach. Now, that said, if an organization participated in this program, they say, you know what, we find this to be great, and we also would like to indicate that we have competitive advantage by saying we're maturity level 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, you can still participate that way. Now, I can't speak to what that means on behalf of the agency or how they're going to treat that, but that happens. That happens all the time with organizations, that they, the Raytheons and the Boeings, for example, CMMI level 5, right? So it is out there, but what it translates to in terms of an FDA accreditation, I think, still is something longer term to be determined.
I just wanted to add to that a little bit. I've had a couple people come up to me after the presentation and sort of ask more detail about that. And I didn't want to get too into the weeds, but to George's point, there's two major ways that the model is often applied outside of this industry and just in general. They're called continuous and staged. And staged is the idea that you look at all of the practice areas at a specific level and try to meet all of them in order to get your maturity level. Continuous is you look at all of the practice areas, you look at the ones that make the most sense to your business needs and what's important to you, and then you focus on improving in those areas specifically. And because of the nature of this pilot, we wanted to use the continuous style. So for now, I don't know how accreditation fits into that, and the even more minutia, there's different kinds of ways to conduct the appraisal. The method we're looking at right now allows us to look at a broad scope of the entire organization, whereas generally with a maturity level, you have to look at a very focused subsection, like a specific department. So again, that's a longer term conversation, I think.
I think, Robbie, you had a question?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. So this is Ravi Davar from Illumina. I actually had just 3 comments or suggestions. One is we were having a conversation over lunch, and it's clear that other industries have gone through what we are now going through. And the thought that came to my mind was, should we not have some sort of an outreach type of initiative as a part of our exercise here that would actually go out and maybe get some of those learnings so that we can apply them. One of them that came to mind was the automotive industry. Another was the aerospace industry, and believe it or not, the third was the software industry. Because CMMI kind of grew up, it was developed foundationally on software, as we all know. And, you know, Cisco mentioned this earlier, there's a huge digital health convergence here. There's lots of mobile medical applications. And the immediate thought that comes to mind is, if that's software and we're doing CMMI, why are they not applying CMMI to software that's medical device? I mean, it's almost a no-brainer, right? Because there's not so much of a question of translation of medical device requirement to software. It's software. It's CMMI. It was born and bred on software, so can we not apply it? It's just an example. The second point was culture. I second what was just suggested. I would really like to know if we can actually inject that element of culture that Joe referred to, that we're going to develop into the maturity model, because it's not jumping out at me. I get it. I get continuous. I get staged. I understand you get there, but I'm not getting how culture is built into the capability maturity model today in our exercise. And last but not the least, I wanted to mention, you know, there's a lot of work going on in preventive medicine and in genomics, and in the area of assays, and, you know, in the area of in vitro diagnostics and things like that. We're talking implantables, we're talking other devices. We've got to start thinking about what constitutes quality for those types of things as we get into personal medicine.
Okay.
So if I could just comment on a couple of thoughts there. I'm not going to touch the last one because it seems a little bit more complicated than what I was running through my head at the moment. So the first one in the construct and the concept of the culture piece of it, you know, I think that there's definitely room for incorporating that, not necessarily into the model, right? One of the things I think I've seen, at the very least up until now, is the model and what it results demonstrates is kind of the proof in the pudding that the culture is there in some way, shape, or form, right? It's those pieces that are in some ways demonstrable, right? It doesn't dictate what you use to drive the culture. So, you know, saying that we want to incorporate that into the model assessment, okay, we could try that route, but maybe there's a better way to kind of incorporate that into the construct of, as you were talking about it, maybe if we're talking about a certification, right, maybe it's not necessarily driven by this. Maybe there's other ways to look at the concept of certification for the med device space. And again, we leave an option for using the model in a staged format, but there are a lot of benefits right now, especially as we're both learning through this process of following the continuous structure that's set up. So I want to make sure that you understand that I like the construct and the idea of, can we get to a sort of certification that maybe incorporates this, incorporates that, you know, what does that look like? As I said, feel free, throw all that stuff on the table. How do we figure that out and get there? Don't necessarily think that we need to redefine the model, because the model does a very good job of looking, seeing what's there, and then coming back and telling you, yeah, they've got the right culture. It's being driven, it's aligned. Here's where you see it in practice, which I think is a big relevant takeaway, at least that I've seen, and I'll let George or Kim correct me on it. So just to put that in perspective, there's ways that we can tailor this and really rethink, as we're talking about reimagining systems and how we do this. You know, that's definitely big. It's a key piece. Let's not lose that. Let's figure out then what the right approach and application to that might be. And it may be, again, with a lot of the work that's being driven through AvaMed as an add-on or something else that we look at and consider for what does a certification look like in this space. Just another point on the digital health initiatives and what's going on there. Don't think that they didn't exercise a lot of the construct and concept of CMMI, right? I think what went on and what they're really looking to do and build there leverages a lot of maybe what goes on even in that space. I think people started to see similar parallels. But, you know, when we talk about the idea of the certification, if you look at what they're doing, right, that is just one piece of it, right? It's the way things are driven. It's the practice areas that help move things in one direction or another. But they are looking to not just get a definition and understanding of the practices, right? That's okay. But there's all these other elements, you know. They are really looking and tackling about that, the whole organizational excellence piece. They're incorporating the culture. They're incorporating that patient safety, the clinical responsibility perspective, and how they're looking at that certification. So it's the reason why it's not just drive to and use CMMI. There's a lot that can be leveraged and learned from there, but there's a lot of other stuff that they're looking to really get a better handle on, redefine, and really think through differently in terms of how they really get that assurance and confidence at what's happening at that developer, and then, you know, drive a certification program around that construct.
And Robert, you had a
Yeah, just a quick question. So as you look at 2018 and the pilot, certainly for the MDDA, do you feel like you're getting the right feedback, or that you've got it structurally set up to get the right support from the industry partners as this evolves, so that you can be making the proper assessments, or are there other things that you think you need or support you need from some of the pilot organizations?
So for the first question, do I think we've set it up? No. I think we've got some learning to do, and I'm learning all the time as to what I could do better to set it up in order for that to succeed. I don't have 100% of an answer as to what we could look like. As I shared earlier, there's things that we've already learned in terms of just even putting out there what we've got, making it more transparent, that we've got some work to do on our end. So what we need from the industry partners, yes, there's definitely always additional help that we could use, right? Again, you guys have a lot more insight into what's going on at your facility, what the impact might be, right? The more we get an idea of, even as we're considering, changes or ways to look at things differently, what that drives or could drive. We've had even some of the early discussions, right? Maybe looking at things in a certain way would drive a completely different and negative set of behaviors. That's not what we were looking to do. So that perspective, always key. The idea of how much burden is this adding versus the value it's delivering, always critical. One thing that we've used a lot is, just really candid, obvious feedback when we say, here's what we're thinking. Look at this wonderful template. Go look. And we get back, well, that makes no sense. Oh, no, it's actually more polite. So give me can we talk about this? So we got a couple of questions that we're not clear on. That's when I'm like, okay, we screwed that one up. Let's go figure out what we did wrong. But getting an understanding of better ways to do that, always that engagement, really sharing, what we want to try to, what we want to try to get to. We're open, right? We're not really prescribing. We're not dictating. We want to find a way to do this within the realms of what you're already doing, because one of the things that we know, we talk about the culture piece, but the other piece of all this is you make doing the right thing easy. Everybody does the right thing. There's no arguments, there's no concerns, there's no missteps, there's no anything falling out. So always driving towards that element is something I think we've got in the forefront, and the feedback is critical to that.
I think one of the ways that we can continue to just improve that feedback loop is just by please encourage people or yourself if you're interested to join one of the working groups and be part of that participation, listening to the feedback, providing your input. I think we sort of have a good setup for now, where we have feedback coming in from the organization that's been appraised. We've got feedback coming in from the lead appraisers. We're bringing that back to the working group that consists of MDIC, industry, FDA, institute, appraisers. And then we're able to then take that feedback and turn it into action items where we can then go and try to resolve some of those issues or concerns that we're hearing, and then implement it back and then hopefully improve. And then I wanted to just say something quickly about culture. And I think while it might not be specifically called out in the model, I think just the very action of conducting these appraisals helps open up the culture, helps to foster one of increased morale, openness, and continuous improvement by having these open dialogues with people and letting them know that they can be, you know, honest and talk really about their pain points.
Any other comments? Dan?
Actually, to build on what Kim just said, you know, culture is the hardest thing to change, right? It's embedded into each of our organizations, and we all do it a certain way. And Beth said it this morning, we're at the point where we need to transition from a project to a process. Do you have some suggestions or some ideas on how do we actually embed this so that it adds value rather than adding another box to check? Oh, I now have to do a CMMI assessment in addition to blah, blah, blah. Because when we're talking to executive management, how do we incentivize them so that this trickles down into the culture of the organization?
I don't have specifics, but I think the issue that we have to answer is, I think about it as the governance model, and you know, a good governance model is a closed loop system that can react quickly to things. You know, as we scale this up, there's going to be problems. Somebody's going to be unhappy with their assessor. Somebody's going to dispute their score even though it's not intended to be used as a pass-fail. You know, you can just think of somebody's trade secret, they're going to be concerned, got out. So in addition to the real mechanics of enrollment and understanding the model and so forth, you know, we're about to move into the real world of all the things that go wrong when you start to add scale, just like in manufacturing, right? And you take it out of the R&D lab. So I think getting that governance set up sooner versus later in a way that it continues in the way the project has, to speak to all the stakeholders who have a place in this, is cost effective. That's one of the things we got to make sure that we balance the incentives against what it's going to actually cost in terms of time and money. So we need to get a group of people thinking about that, and it's one of the ideas that we have is to engage in a bit of strategic planning, and your inputs will be part of that today, to try to define how have other initiatives done this, because again, we're not the first. But getting that set up early, to me, is going to be really important, because the bumps are going to come. And we have to make sure we don't get a black eye from one of those in a way that we can't respond to.
Yeah, and I think related to that, Rob had a slide that had what he believed the cost of the appraisal was in comparison to an audit. We've also had, because of the Paperwork Reduction Act, we do want to be tracking to collect this information, what's the time that's associated with that, and assigning a dollar value to that so that information can be fed back to the agency in regards to that request. We've also done some initial collection of ROI. We've asked organizations, what is the cost of an inspection, a routine inspection for you? Even without a 483 or a warning letter, there's a lot of variability. When we surveyed that, we heard anywhere from $10,000 to $500,000. You may recall that I think it was Connor Dolan, presented last year that the 30-day change notice, 69 of those out of the Galway facility was costing his organization on the order of $750,000. And I think it was tying up the equivalent of one FDA resource. And so we have some information in that regard. I think the culture piece is a little bit tougher to pin down, obviously, but I believe it's within the model. I think it's within the framework. There's attributes of each particular practice that I think are reflective of culture. There's specific practice areas, such as governance, that I think are reflective of culture. Yes, are there other things that we can bring in, other areas of the model that we can bring in that are more considerate of the people CMM view? Yes, but we have to balance that with the practice areas that we already have in scope. Can we look at your specific maturity model that you may have already built or cultural assessment tool as a part of that appraisal? Maybe, that's a consideration as well, but there's a balancing act here, I think, of what is going to be defined for each organization and their cultural attributes and how they want to look at that, as well as trying to standardize the operations of this particular program.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to end it here. We're going to take a short break. Do we still have time for a break? 10-minute break. When we get back, we'll be breaking into the round tables, and we've got some facilitators, myself and a few other the panel members. But please, round of applause for our panel members, thanking them for earlier today and even now.